We're going to chat for a while. At some point, I'll open it to questions from the floor. So if you see me going like this, it's not because I'm bored, it's because I'm trying to figure out how much time we've got left so that I can squeeze in some questions from the audience. I was really struck the other day when I ran across this quote from Svetlana Alexievich, who was the 2015 Nobel Prize winner, which I'm going to read for starters and then put on the shelf. In the West, people demonize Putin. They do not understand that there is a collective Putin consisting of some millions of people who do not want to be humiliated by the West. There is a little piece of Putin in everyone. It seems to me that's not a bad summary of your book. But I think
I'll use it.
We use it as a blurb on the paperback. Let's leave Putin aside for now and start with why Chelyabinsk. I heard you quoted somewhere saying that basically you threw a dart at a map. If you did, it was a very lucky throw.
It was a lucky throw. It just became clear to me when we were there in 92, when I went back as correspondent for NPR in 92, and was traveling widely all the time, but I was dropping in on places that I wanted one place where I could follow the evolution of people's views, get to know people, officials, so that it wasn't just a cursory, one-issue trip. And frankly, it became much more important than I had imagined when in 2011, 2012, when the opposition protests began in Moscow. And frankly, I think the Western media focused entirely on Moscow, and it was distorting. If you were reading, forgive me, the New York Times, you would have thought the country was up in arms. But out in the provinces, that was not the case. Now, it's true that people were scared, or at least cautious, but also there's a bit of Putin in everyone. Putin gave people, by the benefit of high oil prices and gas prices in 2000 when he came in, he gave people a sense of economic prosperity for the first time. But I'm jumping ahead. But that was, and I didn't start thinking I would write a book, but as it went on, it became clear that this was something that was missing from what people were seeing about Russia. And it was middle Russia, middle America. We'd all been focused too much as if we were writing, as if Washington was America. And as we now know, there's a strange beast out there that we may not fully understand.
One thing I was curious about is that Chelyabinsk was a little more isolated than other provincial cities just because it was home to the Soviet nuclear program and had extra layers of security.
I did throw a dart. You're right. It could have been anywhere. It could have been Perm. It could have been Yekaterinburg, former Sverdlovsk. It could have been, Yaroslavl. It could have been Ryazan, any number of places, and I couldn't decide. But as it turned out, it was a pretty good choice because I didn't just cover the city, but the region, and it bore all the marks of a Detroit, of a Pittsburgh, of a
Birmingham,
everything all wrapped up. And it did have the added fillip that it had been the home of the Soviet weapons. So that hadn't been my intention initially, but it wasn't. It was a nice addition, if you will.
Did you think that might also have made the people there more conservative than you would find in Yekaterinburg?
No, because actually the weapons program was quite isolated from them. They didn't know anything about it until 88, 89. It was totally, in the forest. People couldn't talk about it.
Okay. So give us a sort of overview of Chelyabinsk. What kind of a place is it? You said Detroit.
Well, it's a industrial city, like all Soviet cities, where the industry is pretty much in the center of town, because in the early days, and it also represented and became a great way to describe the effects of World War II, because Chelyabinsk was beyond the Urals. I mean, it's on the far side of the Urals, so it was safe from Hitler. And it was where they sent suspect Soviet Germans to work, because it was far away from, so they could not be collaborators. It was where the factories went in order to build tanks, and became known as Tankograd during World War II. And the population exploded. People were living in unspeakable conditions during that period. It took a while for all of that to resolve. And the legacy of that was that there was kind of a pride, but it didn't make it more conservative, actually. And when Chelyabinsk opened to the West in 92, 93, there was huge excitement. I mean, it was like, wow, you know? I mean, and I describe in the book, you know, going, the Seventh-day Adventists came to Chelyabinsk for about a month. And every night they were in the Communist Party theater. And every night they packed it out. 500, 600 people. Now, not that they all came away going, yes. And it was all very, I mean, and they gave people American flags when they quit smoking after a while. Most of them women and only a few. But people came out saying, this is really interesting. I mean, they were exploring ideas, and they had an unfortunately delusional idea of what the West was, that it had to be paved in gold, that they had the answer to everything. And if only Russia could be like the West, everything would be wonderful. And then, of course, they began to travel, even from Chelyabinsk, whether it was a Turkish vacation or to the Sinai for a beach vacation or whatever. They began to learn more and more about really what the rest of the world was like. And at the same time, they felt betrayed that the West was moving NATO closer and closer to their borders. Relations were not going so well. And that's where Putin really played cleverly on people's feelings of, wait a minute. First of all, they felt like betrayed lovers because they had delusional ideas about the West. Second of all, the West began to treat Russia, ignoring it, and in Russians' views, treating it like losers. And it was a toxic combination.
Yeah. A lot of your characters, including the most sophisticated of them, come across as walking contradictions. You know, you have the magazine editor who dresses like something out of Vogue, but thinks that the West really is conspiring to bring Russia to its knees. You know, you have a lot of characters who idolize Western culture, but feel humiliated and defensive about Stalin, for example.
Who becomes more popular by the day. It's a total contradiction, and one of the most poignant, I think, characters is somebody who really wants to make changes, but he supports the Putin vertical just passionately, even though that is what is stopping him from doing what he wants, to make the necessary changes. And you can't argue with him. I mean, you sort of reach a dead end. It's like, no, things have to stay the way they are. And I think there's an element, a big element there. Putin may be not the best thing that came down the pike, but it could be worse. And in fact, what's going on in Chelyabinsk now, I hope I can go back. Friends think that's unlikely there, but we'll see. But there's, you know, on the one hand, you do have this very strict Putin vertical, where it would appear that, anyone who goes against him and anybody who puts their head against the transom and becomes too popular, their head gets chopped off. But there is a very nasty war going on in Chelyabinsk between the FSB, the heir to the KGB, and the governor's office. And it's all about power. It's all about money. It's not about ideology. And it is really vile. And it represents a little bit of where people say, you think Putin's bad, it could be a lot worse. I mean, we could really have ultra nationalists here. And one of the things I kept saying to friends is, okay, but where are the red lines? Where is it where the kids will say, no? The kids are utterly apathetic, and Putin has very cleverly played the internet. They can download whatever music they want, whatever movies they want. For a while, the economy was really doing pretty well until 2012-13. But now he's turned it around saying, okay, the economy's not doing so well. It's because of the West. And we're going to become self-sufficient because of this and stronger. There's no evidence of that yet, and it's a big challenge. So we'll see if that happens. But the internet is, but on the other hand, the internet and, some poor schmuck who says, I don't believe in God, suddenly gets a sentence. I mean, why is he singled out for posting this on the Russian version of Facebook? And there are any number of people, more people this year, who just first have come under the extremism laws, which are all so vague that anybody can come under them, depending on the court in the region. So it's a mix. Once again, a contradiction. There's, on the one hand, it seems a lot of freedom. The kids say, we don't notice anything. We can travel. We can, they're back in the kitchen, essentially, with the internet.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, and the role it's played in Chelyabinsk in maybe even pre-Putin in the Yeltsin years.
The church was very slow to sort of get with the program initially. It didn't know how to deal, especially out in Chelyabinsk, which the communists had proudly called a godless region. It was very scientific. There were a lot of, it didn't have as much presence as it might have in some other towns, because people were highly academic and it was sort of really caught unawares and had no idea how to begin to be a community activist and reach out and have Sunday schools and be anything other than it had been. And so a lot of foreign missionaries pretty savvily targeted Chelyabinsk, like the Seventh-day Adventists, who had limited success, but a lot of Pentecostal and Baptist churches went out there and did a lot early on with addicts, and specifically, they were the first ones to set up any kind of addiction centers, crude as they may have been. They were better than the state ones. So they made quite a lot of inroads, and then the church, having earned a lot of money because it was getting tax-free cigarettes and importing tax-free cigarettes and liquor, managed to, and gradually it became popular and the right thing to do if you wanted to influence the right people to support the church, build a church, and that has continued. But I was with a professor, and he had asked the kids at university, he had asked the kids in his class, okay, how many of you are believers? And 2/3 raised their hands, and he said, how many of you can name the 4 evangelists? 2 out of 40. I mean, but that doesn't mean to say that it's necessarily powerless by any means, just because of their ignorance, but it is a knee-jerk. I mean, everybody wears crosses now, Orthodox crosses. If the Protestant churches had a fair go in the 90s, it's very hard for them to open new churches. The Orthodox Church increasingly is becoming more sophisticated in its propaganda, and they have a TV program now in Chelyabinsk. So it's building.
What does the Russian Orthodox network programming look like?
Pretty boring.
Okay. You wrote a bit about the LGBT community, and I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about that, in part because Putin has made it an article of his sort of anti-Western strategy that that we're trying to sow homosexuality among the youth of Russia, the whole business during the Olympics, when that came out. What was it like? What's it like to be gay in Chelyabinsk?
Probably better than most of you would think, but not as great a life as somebody who's gay would like.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, and it's gotten more difficult. I have unquestionably, but there is this one in particular, very popular, well-attended gay bar restaurant that's open on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sunday nights, where it is packed, and it has the funniest, best entertainment in town. First night I actually didn't understand most of it, but it was so camp and so funny, and none of the words were in my dictionary. And they're also very careful. There are bouncers, they check people, no weapons, no drugs, they pat you down, they make sure there are cameras in the bathrooms, they don't want to be shut down. And curiously, I mean, I'm sure they could find, if they want to, the tax police, anybody can find any reason to shut anyone down, and they haven't. So, I mean, is life really that sort of interesting for anybody interested in the arts or whatever in Chelyabinsk? And the gay community has a predilection for liking those things, and so a lot of them are moving to Yekaterinburg, where it's even better.
Or less bad.
So it's possible, but where people are, if you want to adopt, if you have adopted in the past when things were a little easier, people are afraid their kids are going to be taken away from them because of the law as it stands doesn't ban homosexuality per se, but is probably I know many of you know all of this, but it bans propaganda that is directed at minors, which essentially means you can't talk publicly about homosexuality because a minor might hear it. And so it's shut down any discussion. The upshot of it is that everybody is sort of back in the closet. You don't say what, if 8 years ago you might have said at work, or people might have known. Now you're much more careful about that sort of thing. And the interesting question is, okay, what if they're feeling about Americans or Western Europeans coming in and pushing the gay movement in Russia? Many of my friends and acquaintances I got to know in Russia said, back off. You're making our life, you're assuming that we can move move tomorrow to where you are. We can't. We're where you are 40 years ago. And you've got to understand that. I mean, remember, homosexuality was illegal until like 91, 92, I can't remember exactly the year it was, and you would be imprisoned. Attitudes are still very conservative, even among liberal Russians who I talk to, friends in Chelyabinsk who are way on the liberal sort of political end of the spectrum. And I'd say, well, what do you think about this? And they go, I don't know anyone who's gay. And then you say, well, what about Uncle Joe? And they go, oh, just eccentric. I mean, it sounds like the conversations I had with my parents 40 years ago. And so the question of how hard to press, because things were doing okay until, people, or some would say, people were sort of coming out, able to live openly until, there were big demonstrations and everybody was pushing the agenda too fast for not just the government, but for the populace at large.
One of my favorite characters in your book is Alexander Vlasov, the forensic pathologist. And he's one of my favorites because he represents what I think of as a kind of peculiarly Russian form of dissident, and there have been outright to the barricades dissidents too, but he's the kind of dissident who sort of calculates how far he can go, occasionally goes a little too far and gets his fingers burned, backs off, but doesn't give up. Talk a little about Vlasov.
This is he was a forensic scientist in the Soviet period. How are you doing? Because we know that you have to.
No. It's just at some point.
He's a fundraiser tonight.
I want to leave a little room for people to ask questions.
But yeah, Vlasov was one of the true joys of being in Chelyabinsk, and I probably left his office, an apartment, more drunk than sober, if I have to admit it. A devotee of champagne, of good champagne, and. But he had been a forensic scientist, and when the Russian economy or Soviet Union broke apart and whatever, he and his wife, a doctor, were making the equivalent of $10 a month, and they couldn't live on it. It was very simple. So he became a funeral director, and the first and only one in Chelyabinsk, and he was very good at it, and was very successful, and the government and the local governor and mayor of Chelyabinsk, and then the governor, whatever, finally demanded more and more and more and more bribes. And he finally said no, and his deputy was shot on his way out of the funeral business. And so Vlasov eventually went back to become the first, and for a long time, the only independent forensics expert in Russia. You'd think, given the Putin courts, and this was in the Putin era, that not exactly something that was going to, where there was going to be a huge demand, but eventually judges actually began to call on him. Now, politically sensitive cases, no way he can have any effect. He tried. I mean, when kids were killed in the military, young men were killed in the military because of the brutal hazing, he investigated those cases very successfully. I mean, and if there had been an open court system, he would have won. But the authorities came to him and said, don't go any further. And I mean, and the judges were also told, don't go any further. So, but there are places where he can make his mark, and he continues, and it's just an extraordinary guy. But I mean, I keep asking him, why don't you? I mean, he's gone through, he's been imprisoned, he's been, he's gone up and down as you note, and I asked him finally, why don't you leave? I mean, you've got a lot of money somehow, still. And he just went, I'm too Russian, and I'm too old, and that's it.
What's it like reporting in Putin's Russia, particularly outside of the Moscow, Petersburg axis.
It was really easy for the longest time. I mean, or seemed to be. I mean, people were, I mean, certainly in the pre-Putin era, I couldn't stop people talking in the 90s and even in the early 2000s. And then after I had retired in 2011 and was able to go back for long periods of time for the first time, I kept going back even when I was in Iraq, but it was only for, a week, a year, and emails. But I thought everything in 2012 was sort of okay. And then they called me in and sort of went, no, it's not okay, actually, you have to leave. But I got a visa the next year.
Bureaucratic inefficiency.
One hopes. One hopes. And the guy who expelled me is in jail for corruption. I mean, all the Russian friends said, but didn't he want a bribe? And I said, I sort of said, is there a way to solve this problem? And he did not pick up on it. So he wasn't going to take one from me, but he apparently had taken them from everybody else and was paying for that. And then the next year I had similar problems, and but they didn't expel me that time, but they took me into the police station. And I think we now realize so they could go and get my computer and see what was on it and whatever. But so it was, and friends of mine, are called in and have been called in and said, she's a spy. She's a very nice woman, but she's a spy. I mean, after all, what pensioner is in, going to Chelyabinsk? I mean, nobody in their right mind would go there on her own dime. And now I just got an email yesterday from friends saying that, they don't anticipate I'll probably be able to go back, and they say that things are just getting worse. I mean, it's not getting better. The crackdown, they've all been called foreign agents, not because of me, and people who were working with NGOs, and I mean, in things that had nothing to do with politics for the most part.
If you went back, what would you want to know? What would you be looking for?
I'd actually want to know what the kids are thinking.
So you have a chapter where you hung out at sort of the Chelyabinsk equivalent of a charter school, sort of more privileged.
Well, for smart kids, not just privileged, but smart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They didn't instill you with a lot of hope for the next generation.
No. Either they knew that they could get out because they were really brilliant scientists, computer types, physicists, whatever, winning the Olympiads for all of those subjects in Russia, and that they would go to Moscow, and then they go to Stanford or MIT or Oxford, Cambridge. They knew that they had a way out. And if they didn't, and they were quite patriotic too. There was an element of Putin in all of them.
So if you went back, you'd want to find out what became of those kids.
Yeah.
And whether their attitudes have changed at all.
And I can't, there's a class of sort of upper middle class businessmen that I got to know a few members. They were very leery of me. Although they all have kids who are in school here. There's a
here,
huge,
as in the U.S.
As in the U.S. at $50,000 a year. There's a raging business in Miami for Russians and from Chelyabinsk too, who have babies there and get citizenship. And I never got a good explanation from the State Department. I mean, when somebody comes, out to here and asks for a visa, I mean, it's pretty clear. Maybe they got the visa they thought early and got the visa 2 years. But if you deceive them.
That's family planning.
Yes. But if you deceive them, that child actually can have the visa, the citizenship revoked. They don't do that. So, I mean, that's another issue I would like to explore further, because there's a business in Miami who deals with Russians. They have translators, they take them to the hospital, they find them you know, they're there for the birth, they translate everything, if the people, I mean, it's a...
Wait till Donald Trump hears about that. Maybe give you guys a shot if you have questions. Patty's got a microphone.
Yeah, please use the microphone.
You can. There's a gentleman there, I think, who's got
It's lovely to see you again, Annie, after 36 years.
Yes,
I look
just
forward- Look forward to reading your book. You said in the beginning that Stalin was getting more and more well-loved as time went on. Communism isn't, though, apparently, and neither is, you know, the desire to wall themselves off from the West. So what explains that?
Well, I always felt that, I mean, when the Soviet Union broke apart, all the other constituent republics could blame Moscow and the Russians for everything. And they didn't bear any responsibility. Not even, you know, even though they did. I mean, there was never really an accounting. And they could dredge up all of their folklore and things that have been buried, and it was Russia that was bad, it was Moscow. And it, just another reason why Russians felt beaten up. And they too didn't know what was good in their past. And it was hard. You know, it was for a while, as you well know, and I mean, in the late 80s and 90s, I mean, people were writing about their suddenly revealing what had happened in their families and reading about the Gulag, and in a way that had, to the point where actually kids would say, enough already, okay, I want to go listen to...
Terror, yeah, so what?
And so I think that's part of it. And Stalin, well, there are historians now. I mean, it's not just Stalin, but it's a friend of mine who's a historian at Chelyabinsk University, and a very good one. I mean, he was going to a meeting with foreign conference where there would be foreigners, and he was called in beforehand and said, "You will not reveal anything that reflects badly on this country." So how do you discuss history? So it's shutting down. And if indeed you do want access to certain archives, you will not be allowed to travel abroad now. So that limits academics in terms of what they will look into or not. And the other thing is that I was really lucky that I met with archivists and got to know them in 2011 and 2012. Because now when I see them in coffee houses, not at the archives. They would not be allowed to meet me.
And I'm sorry to default to the obvious breaking news question, but how should we all think about the Trump-Putin tango? How do you think about it?
Well, they're sort of peas in a pod, aren't they?
No, Putin's smart.
Well, yeah, are they peas in a pod? I mean,
Well,
do you think they're equal negotiators, for instance, or do you think
I mean,
Mr. Putin's asking him to be served up?
Putin's a lot better than Trump, but no, I only feel comfortable saying that I think that the phenomenon of Trump is very similar to the Putin phenomenon. I mean, he's playing to, we'll make the country great again. I mean, that's what Putin has successfully,
Yeah,
I mean, it's sort of ironic.
The KGB and the other's bankrupted 4 casinos.
I'm sorry?
I said, but one ran the KGB and the other's bankrupted 4 casinos, so I wanted to...
No, I'm not equipped to answer the question. It's a good one, though.
I would also, sorry, I have to ask a Trump question. So I know Trump built in New York the Condominium Hotel and other buildings with the
I'm sorry?
Trump built in New York with the help of Russian oligarchs. I think one name was Felix Sater. Did you come across these people?
No, I didn't know that. I mean,
There are like 2 or 3 of them. So.
I'm sure they probably go to the same clubs.
Sorry.
Similarly, it's not my area.
It's not Chelyabinsk.
Hi, Anne. Nina Ognyanova with the Committee to Protect Journalists. My question is, what would the American media do better in reporting Russia today?
I think get out of Moscow. I mean, seriously. When's the last time you saw anybody get out of Moscow, except maybe to go to Ukraine? And I mean, I sort of gave a shorthand, but I mean, I was not there, and I was reading the media from Iraq or wherever in 2010, 11, and if I had just relied on that, I would have thought the whole country was, in opposition. Well, that's not true. And we may not, I mean, all of our friends, basically our friends are back in the kitchens, talking. They said they would never go back. Well, that's where they are. Or on blogs where they're not putting their head above the transom somehow. They're not so important that anybody's paying attention to them, but you can be, fingered for the craziest things. So, I mean, I think we need to explain why. And it may be distasteful. We may not want to appreciate or understand why people like Putin. But I think that we need to, what mistakes did we make mistakes as Americans in terms of treating Russia like a loser? Why is it that Russians are increasingly, anti-Western, whereas as you described this one friend of mine or acquaintance of mine who's a magazine editor and dresses in the fanciest Western clothes, but loathes the West. It's all, and is this gonna last? Does this have staying power? Are there red lines? I think we need to keep asking those questions rather than just sitting in the kitchen listening to our friends bemoan, and the opposition, is Putin has brilliantly played on them. He's divided and conquered them with absolute ease because they've eaten themselves for lunch. And so we need to look more critically at what happened there rather than sort of just saying, oh, it's Putin, it's Putin. Well, I'm sorry, unfortunately, it's also the opposition.
I hate questions to journalists about predicting the future, since our job is what happened yesterday, not what happens tomorrow. But I mean, what you're saying sort of suggests that Putinism will outlive Putin.
Or be worse. Quite possibly. There, several of the sort of successful upper middle class people I know sort of are going along with it because, it could be worse. And I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but that's sort of why I said, what can we do? We have to sort of accept the fact that it exists. And it's not just Putin as a personality writing books about Putin, but Putin as and there are these, and I'm just beginning to learn about them now in Chelyabinsk. These new fights that are going on between different groups. I don't know to what degree it's a threat to Putin, or if it's just local, but it's pretty nasty. And I think we need to look at those.
And there were things that I really loved in your book. There were a couple things that I really hated.
That you what?
Hated.
Oh,
hated. You know that word, hate?
Oh, yes.
It's big in American politics. What I thought was particularly wonderful was when you were talking about Amway. Because in contrast to some slug like Jeffrey Sachs, Amway is the soft Power of American and Mary Kay, showing how people can take some economic entrepreneurial role in their own lives. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit more than you did in the book about what the example of that kind of limited entrepreneurship catching on and teaching people did to, not kids so much as middle-class people, school teachers and people who had been bureaucrats, in changing how they saw what they could do with their lives. And what I hated in your book, I think somebody has to stand up for Boris Nikolaevich. I think you made him up into a straw man. I don't think he set out to have a corrupt regime taking out. I think he knew what he was against, but didn't know what he was for, and lost control. And I thought some of your sentences setting up the contrast of Putinshina with what Yeltsin tried to do were frankly wrong. I mean, I think even Yegor Gaidar, fat little pig that he was, understood that Bukharinist notion of enrich yourselves. It's just who got to enrich themselves. But I really like the Amway part.
That's what you call a mixed review.
Yeah, I'd say so. Woof! Were you the one who wrote it on No. I mean, what was exciting beginning in 2000 was the emergence of the middle class. I mean, to start with, they had all been scurrying around, trading, going to China, going to Poland, going wherever they could to buy goods and sell on the streets in the freezing cold, and then running to the bank. Everybody, even in the villages, became a foreign currency expert. And then the stability began to emerge in 2000, and you could finally get, a mortgage, credit, begin to build a business. And there were lots of opportunities if you were smart, whether it was building steel doors or double pane, triple pane windows, or Amway, curves, big deal in Chelyabinsk. Stores, the commercial world exploded. Restaurants, an Irish pub, sushi, Chinese, you name it, and really high end. So things were really growing and moving, and the crash of but it didn't. None of that really. Consumer goods were still all imported. Food was largely imported. Good food, other than cabbage and whatever.
And caviar. And caviar.
Yeah, well, that became harder and harder. That was not to get. It wasn't like the old days. But that I thought maybe in 2012, when everything the economy began to shrink, and literally people's income shrank from 2012 to 2015 by 30% at least. And I thought that was going to be the red line. No. People bought it, ate it, said this is going to be good for us. We're going to become self-sufficient in food. They bought, even though Putin and his government has not made it easier to create and grow businesses, and hasn't been that generous to agriculture. Nonetheless, people believe it, want it. And that red line has not been the red line I thought it might have been.
We'll go to Bethany.
Hi. So thanks for the book. Congratulations. It sounds like you've crystallized so many things going on in modern Russia that those of us who've been in and out of the place for years are seeing going on. So my question is, if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing about Russia today, what would it be?
That's not my job. God. Well, of course, I'd remove fear if I could. Because increasingly, if fear is too strong a word, caution has become the byword. And that makes me sad. As a friend of mine said in 88, 89, I'm out of the kitchen and I'm never going back. Well, they're back in the kitchens. The conversations, that's where they happen.
We're going to Andy.
Anne's great answer on the spot with the fear. What about, a little bit analogous question to media coverage.
I'm sorry, I can't.
A little bit analogous to the question about media coverage. What about American foreign policy and the implications of, what do you think is the awareness and appreciation and understanding of Putin's domestic popularity and positions, and how does that relate to American foreign policy? I guess I'm talking about the current administration.
Well, Tom Graham actually is a pretty good piece today. Where was it? Foreign policy? I don't know. But I mean, it just, there are things that we can do with them, that we need to do with them. And I mean, we can't just, we worked with them in the Soviet period when it was as bad on key issues, and we need to go back to that. And I'm not, now the Russians know more about our sins, of which there are many. And we haven't, we've got so many problems of our own. I frankly find our finger pointing on human rights. I think we have to be more nuanced, more careful. I mean, not that we should ignore those things, but there are other issues where we really can maybe work together. We're coming from it with different priorities, but and Graham, points out a lot of, the difficulties. But I think we have to. We can't just lock them out. We can't ignore them. We can't ignore their concerns. Russia is a country with, huge nuclear arsenal. It's got enormous natural wealth. Do we really want to push him towards China? There are lots of questions about, what works for us and not. But I think we just have to be really clever about how we handle it.
You can do one more.
Yeah, one more.
I want to ask you about
Let's get somebody else.
absolutely.
Annie, thank you so much for having dedicated this time all these years. I'm really looking forward to the book. I want to go back to sort of the day-to-day reality, and wondered if you had found much change in the education system from the rote learning approach of all those years until the sort of opening and the breakup of the Soviet Union, where more critical thinking was being introduced into some of the schooling. That always strikes me when I think of the propaganda that is accepted as being one source
That's a really
of the
good
easy
question.
acceptance.
It looked like that sort of thing was changing, but the rote learning still continues. And there are the charter school sort of that I described, which is really a science tech. They're taught to think. It's a very special place. But I'm a Fulbright scholar who was there a couple of years ago, was at the Teacher Training College, and she was using TED Talks to encourage development of English, in which she was teaching. And she chose one in particular that was sort of analyzing the educational changes that needed in the educational system here. And it was a great discussion. And she then posed questions to the kids who were 19, 20, 21, in teacher training college, and they said, "Oh, that's not for us, that's for the authorities." And it was just, wait a minute, this is 2014. It might as well have been 1981. It was so depressing. And that's, I mean, you see it again and again and again.
The book is Putin Country. I highly recommend it. Round of applause for Anne Garrels.